10 years ago, 5 law schools had a median LSAT of 170 or above. Today, that number is 28. And if you're planning to apply to law school in the next year or two, that single stat should change how you think about your LSAT score, your school list, and your scholarship money. Because your LSAT score buys you less than it did 2 years ago, and there are 5 specific reasons why. Some of these you probably heard of. At least 2 of them nobody in LSAT prep wants to talk about. I'm going to walk you through all 5, show you the data, and then tell you exactly what I'd do differently if I were starting my LSAT prep right now. If I had to pick the single biggest driver of what's happened to LSAT scores, it's this. The rules around retaking the LSAT completely changed, and most people haven't caught up to what that means. Before 2017, you could take the LSAT 3 times in 2 years. There were 4 test dates per year, and when you applied to law school, schools reported the multiple scores that you had. Think about that for a second. Under those rules, retaking was risky. If you scored lower the second time, it could have dragged your average down. More schools were considering multiple scores. But now, you could take the LSAT up to 5 times over 5 years, 7 times in your life. There are 8 test dates per year, and the ABA changed the rules so schools only have to report your highest score, meaning only your best score matters. You get 7 shots, and if you're not sure how you did, you can buy something called Score Preview, see your score, and if you don't like it, you can cancel it before any law school ever sees it. So what happened? From 2010 to 2018, about 68% of people taking the LSAT were first-timers. A third were retaking, and that was normal for years. But by 2023, less than half were first-timers, and the majority were retakers. We crossed the tipping point. More people are now retaking the LSAT than taking it fresh. And retakes work. The average gain on a second attempt is about 2.6 points. Third attempt is another 2.3 points. It might not sound like much until you realize that 2 to 3 more points can be the difference between a scholarship and paying full sticker price. Now multiply that across the entire test-taking population. Tens of thousands of people, each submitting only their best score out of multiple attempts, with the bad scores filtered out before schools ever see them. So the scores that law schools receive are not a random sampling of your ability. They are a curated highlight reel, and every school's median rises as a result. And that is the engine underneath everything else I'm about to show you. And it gets worse because while everyone was retaking more, the LSAT itself changed twice. First big change, the LSAT literally got shorter. The classic LSAT, the one that existed for decades that I took back when I was first studying, it had 5 sections. 2 scored logical reasoning, 1 scored reading comp, 1 scored logic games, and 1 unscored extra section called the experimental. Roughly 100 scored questions across 4 scored sections, 3.5 hours of testing. During the pandemic, they cut it to 3 sections with no experimental, only about 2 hours. They called that the LSAT Flex. Post LSAT Flex, they added the extra section back in, but they never went back to 4 scored sections. So today's LSAT has only 3 scored sections, about 75 scored questions instead of 100. That's about 25% fewer scored questions than the test I prepped students for decades back. Now, why does that matter? Because stamina was part of the test. A 5-section exam over 3.5 hours? You can't fake that. You can't just be sharp for an hour. You had to hold it together for half a day. A shorter LSAT is more forgiving. And more forgiving tests compress scores towards the top. The second big change, they killed logic games. After the June 2024 LSAT, LSAC removed the analytical reasoning, aka logic game section, and replaced it with a second scored logical reasoning section. This happened because of a 2019 lawsuit settlement where 2 blind test takers argued the section violates the ADA because it essentially required drawing diagrams. LSAC settled the lawsuit and had to phase out the section of logic games entirely for everybody as part of the settlement. Now, LSAC claims the change had virtually no impact on scores. They claimed that the mean score moved by 1/100th of a point. But here's what actually happened in the real world. In the first full cycle after the format change, applicants scoring 175 to 180 were up 31%. Those in the 170 to 174 band were up 40%, and those in the 165 to 169 band were up 36%. And LSAC reported a 42% increase in applicants with scores between 175 and 180 compared to the prior year. Now, was all of that the format change? No, of course not. Test taker volume was up too. Plenty of people were retaking. But logic games was the section where people often hit ceilings. You could be a phenomenal reader with razor-sharp reasoning skills and still get wrecked by a hard sequencing game. It was the great differentiator. And that differentiator is gone. Logical reasoning is now 2/3 of your test, which happens to be the section that students are best able to improve on currently. So the floor is rising and the ceiling's being pushed higher at the same time. We've got a shorter test with the hardest, most intimidating section removed and scores compressed upward. That is the second force. Now, the next one I'm going to talk about is a little bit uncomfortable. Nobody in LSAT Prep really talks about this because it's a sensitive topic and it's easy to be misunderstood. So I want to be clear about what I'm doing here. I'm just going to talk through the numbers from LSAC's own published research. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm describing a structural change in the testing population that affects the score distribution for everybody. The LSAT offers accommodations, primarily extra time, for test takers with documented disabilities. That is required by the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it matters. People with legitimate disabilities deserve equal access. In 2012, LSAC approved 729 accommodation requests per year. By 2017, only 5 years later, it was 3,000 requests. By 2023, it was approximately 15,000 requests. So over a 5-year period, 2012 to 2017, it approximately quadrupled. Then over the next 6 years, from 2017 to 2023, it quintupled, a 5x once again. So a 6x, then a 5x, meaning 30x overall, more or less. Now, at the same time, the accommodations approval rate went from 46% to roughly 98%. The most common diagnosis is now ADHD. Now, here is the score data, and again, this is from LSAC's own research. Test takers who receive extra time score about 4 to 5 points higher on average than standard time test takers. Test takers who switched from the standard timing to extra time saw average gains of about 7.5 points. And LSAC's own researchers concluded that extended time scores, their words are, and I quote, are simply not comparable to scores from standard administrations. They tend to overpredict how students actually perform in law school. But here's the piece that connects this to the arms race. Law schools receive no indication that a score came from an accommodated test. LSAC does not flag it. They are not permitted to under the ADA. A 170 with time and a half looks identical to a 170 with standard conditions on a score report. So you've got a much larger share of the testing pool receiving accommodations that produce measurably higher scores, and the institutions using those scores can't tell the difference. That shifts the entire distribution. It raises medians, and that changes the scholarship math for everybody. Now, I want to be careful here because many of those 15,000 people have genuine documented needs. The system exists for a reason. But the scale of the change and the fact that it's invisible to law schools is a structural force pushing scores upward. That is just what the data shows. Now, here's a recent one where the consequences are still playing out. In August 2025, LSAC announced the suspension of online testing in mainland China. The reason is that organized cheating operations have been running for years on the remote LSAT. Here's what was happening. Companies were using software to bypass LSAC's proctoring security. They deployed proxy test takers where someone else sits for your exam from anywhere else in the world, including the US and Canada. While taking the test, those proxies were screenshotting questions, and those screenshots were compiled into study documents and sold. And these were not practice questions, they were actual LSAT questions still in active rotation that had been leaked without LSAC's knowledge. Now, LSAC's response tells you how serious this was. First, they shut down remote testing in China. Then in February 2026, they announced that starting this August, remote LSAT testing is being eliminated everywhere, not just in China, but entirely. All US and international test takers go back to in-person testing centers, with rare exceptions. About 40% of test takers have been taking the LSAT remotely, and here is a revealing detail. Remote test takers accounted for the majority of score holds, cases where LSAC flags a score for investigation. Now think about what this means. If cheating inflated top band scores over the past few years, then the medians schools built during that period are partially based on fraudulent results. And now every honest test taker is chasing benchmarks that may have been artificially set. Now, of course, we're not going to know the full impact until we see scores from the first fully in-person testing cycle starting later this year. But the question hanging over all of this is, how much of the score inflation was real and how much was fraud? Now, the last force is not about the test at all. It's about who's showing up to take it. The 2025 admissions cycle saw an 18% increase in applicants and a 22% increase in applications, the highest volume in over a decade. The current cycle is running about 15% above that. We're about 50% above where we were just 2 years ago. Total 1L enrollment for fall 2025 hit almost 43,000 students, up 13% from just 2 years prior. Now, what's driving it? It's that the world feels unstable. Employment outcomes for recent grads, however, are the best on record. The class of 2023 had a 93% employment rate, median salary of $90,000. And so when the JD looks like a safe bet, people apply. And then we also have the push of AI anxiety, political chaos, economic uncertainty, the same pattern that followed the 2008 crash, the 2016 presidential election, and of course the 2020 pandemic. When the world feels like it's breaking, law school feels like a calling and a safe haven. But here's what makes this force different from the other four. More applicants doesn't just mean more bodies, it means more higher scoring applicants. When the pool grows by 50%, the number of people scoring 170 plus grows even faster. Schools can raise their medians and expand class sizes at the very same time, and that's of course exactly what they did. Average class sizes went up almost 10%, and medians still climbed nearly 2 points in a single year. So let's pull all of this together. More people retaking, a shorter, easier test, more accommodated high scores, cheating that inflated top bands, and a flood of strong applicants, all five pushing scores in the same direction, and none of them self-correcting. That is the LSAT arms race. Now, let's make this concrete. Over the past decade, every single ABA-approved law school except 4 out of about 200 raised its LSAT median. The average increase was 5 points. 10 years ago, 49 law schools had medians of 160 or above. Today, more than almost double that, 91 law schools with medians of 160 or above. And so if you're an applicant, it's going to feel like a school that you thought was a safety might have actually become a reach. That school would have raised its median by at least 2 points in the past year on average. Now let's talk money. About 80% of law students get some form of tuition discount, but only 7% get full tuition or better. The median law school scholarship is about $24,000 per year, against an average total cost of attendance of $82,000 per year. And of course, scholarships are tied to LSAT score bands. When medians rise, the score that used to put you in scholarship range now barely gets you admitted. Some schools actually reduced their discount rates during the surge, meaning they gave out less money per student because they could still fill seats without it, and they're not giving out money if they don't have to. Now, if you get a conditional scholarship, one that requires you to maintain a certain GPA, you should know that nearly 2,000 students lost scholarship money last year, about 5% of the entire 1L class. Meanwhile, summer associate hiring hit its lowest point since the NALP started tracking it in 1993. Law firms are citing uncertain demand and the impact of AI. The entrance is getting wider, but the exit is getting narrower. Now, everything I just showed you is a reason to be more strategic, not more afraid. The LSAT arms race punishes people who just study harder and hope for the best, but it will reward those who make better decisions. Now, here's what I would do differently if I were starting right now. First, you want to stop chasing a number. A 170 in 2026 is not the same as a 170 in 2022. What matters isn't your score, it's your position relative to each school's current median and each school's scholarship bands. Before you sign up for another test, look up the fall 2025 ABA 509 data for every single school on your list. Figure out what score is going to put you in scholarship range at each one and work backward from the money. Second, if you're going to retake, know exactly why. The average retake gain is real, but retaking without changing your approach is how you end up on attempt number 4 with the exact same score. Is it timing? Is it a specific question type? Is it how you're reviewing? If you can't answer that question specifically, a retake probably isn't going to help. Third, I want you to rebuild your school list. If you're basing it on data from 3 to 4 years ago, it's wrong. Schools moved 1 to 3 points in a single year. A school where you're only 1 point above the median is not a safety, it's a 50-50, it's a coin flip. You want actual safeties with actual scholarship money. Fourth, I want you to negotiate. Most applicants make the mistake of accepting their first offer. If you have competing offers, you want to use them. If you're above a school's median, you have leverage. If they gave you a conditional scholarship, convert it to a guaranteed scholarship. The worst they're going to say is no. And the fifth, and I'm biased here, but the data backs me up, you want to get someone in your corner who sees the full board. The LSAT arms race is not won by simply studying more. Everybody has access to prep materials. But what the software can't do is tell you when to stop retaking, which schools to target given your current numbers, how to negotiate a scholarship offer, or when to pull the trigger on an application versus waiting for a better cycle.